see. Okay.
All right. And there's one other person. Is this everybody seeing the splash screen here?
Yes.
Okay, good, excellent, thank you. Hello, good morning, good afternoon to everybody, and thank you for coming to our panel, Theory and Politics, Inequality and Social Justice at this 53rd NCOBPS. I am Anand Kamisung. I teach here in the Political Science Department at Cal State Long Beach, and I will be your chair and discussant as well for this panel. And let me just, that's the splash screen, but I suppose you kind of might want to see who I am. So there we go. I hope everybody's doing well, and I think we should just jump right in. So we have 5 panelists this afternoon. I'm going to keep saying morning. It's just going to happen because I'm 3 hours behind Eastern, so it's morning for me. But if I remember, I'll say afternoon. We have 5 panelists today, my pronouns are he, him, and I think if it's all right with the panelists, we can go in the order of the program. And if you do not have the program, that order is Jamiee Swift, Dehjah Vaughn, Austin Lewter, Justin Zimmerman, and Angela Pashayan. All right, so let me start. Our first presenter is going to be Jamiee Swift, who is a PhD candidate, from Howard in political science, and she's the executive director, creator, and founder of Black Women Radicals. She is also involved in and leader of a myriad other organizations. I'm just reading this here that spans that several of them are transnational, and her areas of study are Black LGBT feminist political thought and behavior in Brazil and in the African diaspora more generally. All right, and her presentation is going to be a note from a Black feminist political scientist.
So thank you so much for the introduction. I actually had a different title. My presentation today is going to be based on my dissertation. It's titled Toward a Queer Africanidade, State Structural and Symbolic Violence in Afro-Brazilian LGBT Women's Resistance in Salvador da Bahia, Brazil. Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. Like I said, like our amazing moderator said, my name is Jamiee Swift. I use she, her pronouns. And so I also have a few slides, if that's okay if I show them. I'm just going to share my screen really quickly to give some further context of what I will be discussing. So 1 second as I share my screen. Okay, here you go. Can everyone see my screen? All right, perfect. So like I said before, my presentation is based on some of my dissertation work. Once again, Toward a Queer Africanidade, State Structural and Symbolic Violence in Afro-Brazilian LGBT Women's Resistance in Salvador, Bahia, Brazil. Essentially, my research looks at the power and the politics of queer, trans, and travesti women, Black queer, trans, and travesti women in Salvador da Bahia, which is the capital city of the northeastern state of Bahia in Brazil. So I'll be discussing more of the political frameworks that I use, and also the importance of interrogating and centering those at the margins in Black politics, particularly from transnational, historical, contemporary, intersectional Black feminist frameworks. So here's just an overview of my presentation. I have a note on language, introduction, statement of the problem, my essential research questions, my hypotheses, frameworks, significance of study, major findings, conclusion, limitations, and hopefully future research. So I just want to make a commentary and note on language. This presentation will interrogate, violence, particularly against Black and other marginalized communities in Brazil. So just want to offer a trigger warning. In the context of Brazilian Portuguese, right, there are gender identities and terminologies that people use that are not, that we don't use in the US. For example, transsexual, homosexual. I will honor those identities, right, to not reify any US or Westocentric or Eurocentric linguistics, right? So I just want to put that there. So with my research, I really honor Marielle Franco, who was an Afro-Brazilian bisexual feminist activist and organizer from the Maré Favela in Rio de Janeiro, right? On March 14th, 2018 was when she was assassinated, right? But she represented all these different elements, right? She was a favelada, a person from the favelas. She was a bisexual, right? She was a politician or a vereadora, a councilwoman. And she stood at all these intersections, but advocated for those who are at the margins, Black folks, queer folks, indigenous folks, condomblecistas, people who practice condomble, right? And working class people. And so when she was assassinated, many say by the Brazilian state for her efforts of resisting against anti-Black state violence, the question became for me was, who are the other Marielles, right? Who are victims and survivors of anti-Black, anti-LGBT, and anti-woman state structural and symbolic violence, right? And so these are just some other unfortunate cases of Black, queer, trans, and gender expansive people in Brazil who did not get the type of attention, right, regarding their deaths, right? Many by the state or the agents, the state agents, right, of Brazil, in Brazil. So at the top, we have Matusa Passarelli, who was a non-binary student activist and organizer who was unfortunately murdered after a party, coming from a party due to their gender identity, right? Then you have this right here in the middle, you have Luana Barbosa dos Reis, who was brutally beaten by the police in front of her son because she was a masculine presenting lesbian, right? And then we have Veronica Bolina, a transsexual woman, fitness model and friend who was falsely accused by her neighbor due to a transphobic rant and was brutally beaten and dismembered while in prison, right? And she was sent to a male prison. So my dissertation looks at these various people, particularly Black, queer, trans, and gender expansive people who are overlooked not only in the discussions on state violence, but also their activism and organizing and resisting against, right, state structural and symbolic violence, particularly in Bahia. And these cases here are of José Leonardo, RAPHAELA Souza, Dehjah Ferreira Lima, who were unfortunately victims of state violence in Bahia, right? And so this is just to provide a context of what is going on. So really quickly, contextualizing violence in Brazil. Brazil houses the largest Black population in the African diaspora outside of Nigeria, right? So we see enslavement, the violence of enslavement starkly there, high rates of anti-Black state violence to the point where activists on the ground are calling what is happening to Black people, particularly young Black poor men, as a genocide, right? There's stark violence against police violence against Black women, right? Black trans people at the margins. In Brazil, 80% of trans murders are Black women, Black trans women, right? And also there's neglect by the Brazilian state, right, regarding census data or information about the queer, trans, and gender expansive communities, but also violence happening against them. And so my statement of the problem is that there's an under-theorization on Black, queer, trans, and gender expansive peoples, particularly Black, queer, and trans women's activism and organizing in the field of Black politics, right? There's anthropologists who do this work critically, right? For example, Kristen A. Smith, Kia Lily Caldwell, and there's several others who do, Andrea Stevenson Allen, who do work, but they're anthropologists, right? I'm saying that there's an under-theorization of this within political science, but particularly its subfield of Black politics. I argue that there's an oversaturation of US global North Black politics, right? With a oversaturation of masculinist, cis heteronormative understandings of what Black politics is. And Black lesbian political scientist Kathy J. Cohen critiques this in her work, Deviance as Resistance, a new research agenda for the study of Black politics, talking about the oversaturation of electoral politics, right? Political participation from US frames and not centering those who are at the margins. And yes, this goes into my other point about overemphasis on Brazilian, European, and North American cis gay men in queer studies, right? And so these are some of the central research questions I asked. I'm not going to go over all of them, but in my research, I went to Salvador da Bahia and interviewed over 25 Black, queer, and trans feminist organizers. And these are some of the questions I asked them, right? And specifically, I interrogate how Afro-Brazilian LGBT women activists in Salvador resisted state structural and symbolic violence since Brazil's redemocratization in the 1980s. These are some of my research hypotheses. My research shows that the participation of Black, queer, trans, and gender expansive women and people's activism in Salvador is significant to Black political thought and behavior, and that these political perspectives and representations of Black LGBT women in Salvador contravene certain heteronormative gender norms and also speaks to the state and quotidian violence that they face every day, right? And also to center Black, particularly Black feminist transnational activism and organizing. Here are some of my theoretical frameworks. Once again, I look to Black politics, particularly Haynes Walton's definition of Black politics in his pioneering work at Black Politics, a Theoretical Analysis, where he describes Black politics as a function of the particular brand of segregation found in different environments which Black people find themselves in. He also, in Black politics and Black political thought and Black political behavior, argues for new conceptualizations of the paradigm of Black politics, right? And so this is where I build off on his offering, Haynes Walton's offering of building new conceptualizations of Black politics that center those who are the most at the margins, right, in the Black community. I also use a Black queer feminist lens as articulated by Kathy J. Cohen and later the Black Youth Project, which once again centers those who you do not usually see in Black politics, such as queer, disabled, fat, dark-skinned, trans, gender expansive people who have always been at the vanguard of our movement building, but have been chronically overlooked. I also use critical race theory to discuss the de jure implications of Portuguese colonial rule and how that has set the stage for the contemporary anti-Black, anti-queer, and anti-woman violence we see today in Brazil. And so, yeah, I know I'm at time, and I once again just want to emphasize this is Americanidade, the theory by Lila Gonzalez, right, who was pioneering anthropologist, activist, and organizer. And she really centered Black and Indigenous women in Brazil in her work. And this is where Torta Queer Americanidade comes from, right? To really center those at the margin. So thank you so much. I'm at time and I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Jamiee. Next, we'll have Dehjah Vaughn, who's a PhD candidate at Clark Atlanta University, her research is on the psychological effects of medical racism by the US national government. For example, Henrietta Lacks, Tuskegee syphilis experiment, and Black maternal death rates are all areas that of her focus. Okay.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Just give me 1 second. All right, thank you so much for the introduction. I appreciate the opportunity of being here. Once again, my name is Dehjah Vaughn. I am a PhD candidate at Clark Atlanta University. And today I am presenting my research on the psychological effects of medical racism by the US national government, specifically looking at Henrietta Lacks, the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, and Black maternal death rates. So the purpose of this study is to focus on 3 different components to be able to identify, to research, and to provide evidence of the psychological effects of medical racism. So firstly, to identify the unique group of systemic issues within the US national government, to research the long impact of medical discrimination after enslavement and the impact on the psyches of African Americans, and to provide a research method of the long history of US national government's involvement against Black people and the failure they've had to protect Black health between Jim Crow and the contemporary period of 2007 and 2022. The research questions that I attempt to answer are just listed here. So number 1 is, how has anti-Black medical discrimination been allowed to happen for so long? What can be learned from the Jim Crow era that links the period of enslavement to the present? In what ways has enslavement influenced institutions? How has enslavement and medical discrimination impacted the psyche of some African Americans intergenerationally? So the medical examinations of Black bodies stems from enslavement. James Marion Sims, who is considered as the father of modern genealogy, conducted research on enslaved Black women without anesthesia, medical ethics, and historians. This concept of examination derived from the racist notion of Black people not being able to feel pain. So for this reason, my research aims to amplify the voices of Black children, Black women, and Black families. So the painting here that I have was drawn by James Denmark in 1987, which symbolizes the depiction of an African-American family. Denmark utilizes different colors, such as like bright coral, rose pink, warm reds, yellows, lavenders, cool blues, white, and silver to showcase the range of colors that the Black family invokes. And also to create the notion that colors can represent feelings and emotions. What situations led me to take this on? The current theme of psychological warfare is displayed through pervasive images and video footage that solicit negative feelings and emotions about self. Specifically, the media attention that has been a trend on social media, the black male deaths being plastered on social media outlets such as Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and that garnering a sort of normalization, and as well as it being desensitized. And formulating, coined by Dr. Cromer, secondary trauma. So my literature review will focus on some of the authors here, like Dr. Frances Cress Welsing, Dr. Claude Anderson, James H. Jones, Harriet Washington, Linda Villarosa, Alondra Nelson, Dr. Cromer, and Professor Kaba. My methodology will specifically focus on the historical research stemming from enslavement, slavery era, as well as the National Institutes of Health, portrait images, and the Center of Disease Control and Prevention. Here we have some of those portrait images that I alluded to in my methodology. The first one we have here is Jabadi Khalil Huffman, who created this portrait as a representation of the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. Huffman refers to this piece of work right here as Tuskegee, as a meditation of the Tuskegee syphilis study. The second one we have here is by Love Wise, which is a portrait called Standing Around, which symbolizes the Black maternal mortality. The third one we have here by Daphne Disdain created a portrait called Bittersweet, which illustrates Natasha Alford's story into motherhood. And lastly, this portrait here by Kadar Nelson. His piece is called Henrietta Lacks, Gila, the mother of modern medicine. The motive of the artist is to acknowledge the medical contributions to over 10,000 medical planets relating to polio, AIDS, Parkinson's disease, and other contributions. Thus, utilizing photographic evidence of these three cases invokes a deeper understanding of concepts as well as experiences. Here is some of the background information and context regarding Henrietta Lacks. One may argue that the medical health industry has made significant amount of profit from Black bodies. For instance, my research specifically focused on Henrietta Lacks, who is considered to be the greatest medical contributor, according to Dr. Claude Anderson. Lacks was treated for cervical cancer at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, Maryland. While being examined, medical practitioners noticed that her cells had unique characteristics. Following her death in 1951, medical practitioners at Johns Hopkins utilized her cells as cloning cells, gene mapping, in vitro fertilization, and testing medicines because of her cells being immortal. For this reason, Lacks' estate is suing Thermo Fisher Scientific, and the date that this case began to come to order was October 4th, 2021. So pretty recent as well. And the case is still ongoing as we speak. As far as the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, James H. Jones, in his book, Bad Blood, the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, addresses the non-therapeutic experiment involving over 300 Black male sharecroppers infected with syphilis. The impact of slavery can be considered as the origin of the unethical treatment of medical examinations on enslaved Africans. According to Jones, the South's peculiar institution had a benevolent system of total control in which conditions necessarily for survival and prosperity of race can be maximized. And these are just photos of the autopsies, the classification of the case, and the memorandum. Last, we have the Black maternal death rates. The anguish and torment that some African Americans experience have lasting effects not only on the body, but the psyche as well. As a result of the psychological impact of unethical treatment of medical examinations against African Americans has transcended generationally, predating from enslavement, when they used to, medical practitioners took full advantage of Black bodies. One could argue that the same is currently going on today. These statistics here say that Black women have a case fatality of 2.4 to 3.3 times higher than white women. The persistent physiological myths of Black women, and the modern medicine education. Therefore, the generational impact of modern medicine and education is influenced by discrimination. To end with my conclusion, medical racism has been perpetuated through government decision-making, inaction, and willingness to do harm, and non-protection and institutional violence. Some solutions could be, one could argue that the Obama administration and their focus on health was a decisive historical change, given the history of medical discrimination supported by the US government. And that is my time. Thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Dehjah. I'm sorry for mispronouncing your name originally. Next, we'll have Austin Lewter, who is from Birmingham, Alabama. He is currently a Pan-African Studies graduate student at Syracuse University.
Thank you for that introduction. And I want to say good morning, good afternoon, as we talked about earlier. And I want to thank the organizers as well as our chair and everyone who's tuned in with us today. Recognize some old friends, and I just want to say thank you all for being here. So my project today that I'll be discussing is work I originally done when I was in Birmingham, Alabama. Let me take a quick note of the time. And it's a very zoomed in example in terms of I was writing about my own undergrad institution. And as I begin, I want us to think about how this work can be extended to the universities, the workspaces that we all are in now. And this project began, I was trying to put in conversation some of my favorite authors at the time and what this meant for my experience at Birmingham Southern College. So as I get started, I think it's important to contextualize the school that I'm talking about here, Birmingham Southern. So Birmingham Southern College is a predominantly white at 80%. There's 1,200 students. It's in, as you figured out, Birmingham, Alabama. And what's important for my research is that gates enclose the campus. The title of my project was The Day the Gates Fall. And I want to talk about some of my inspirations for taking on this project. It is something that, even though being at the institution for 4 years and being involved in a host of organizations, I hadn't considered what message the gates sent to students on campus, prospective students, families visiting, and anyone that knew anything about the school. So it wasn't until on into my senior year, beginning this project, I was thinking of double consciousness with Du Bois and some other works that I kind of began to gain a little bit of clarity as to what I was trying to do. And so my argument throughout the paper is that even though across the country, this is again something that I'm sure is going on at your institutions as well as mine here at Syracuse now, we move forward with DEIA projects and sensitivity trainings and you name it. I'm sure your emails are full of these things. And what happens oftentimes is that the burden is placed onto people of color to, again, fix or alleviate or teach everyone else what they should and shouldn't do. And something that I've been wanting to add to that is what we have to consider, and that's the spatial makeup and the construction and how buildings are and just the impact institutions have on the community around them. And that is what I began to explore at Birmingham Southern, because again, the campus, it's very small, it's dubbed the Hilltop, and it's completely enclosed within the fencing. It varies from steel beams to pointed tops and barbed wire on the backside as well. And we have a campus guard shack that's one way in, one way out. And so when I started looking up the gates and like figuring them out, what was important was that the gates always seemed like they had been there and that they always would be, that they were just a fact of the university. So I began to wonder, when did they, they didn't naturally grow as we think of trees, and they weren't just there. And so I found out that the gates were actually relatively young. They were constructed in 1976. And at that moment, I knew I had to figure out why this was, what happened, what was the university like what was Birmingham like? I mean, we talk about the civil rights movement all the time, so I had to zoom in there. And I think it's important to note that the community surrounding Birmingham Southern College in 1970 was experiencing a ton of white flight. And those reasons can be another study of its own. But what I want to say about the community around Birmingham Southern at the time is that by 1975, it is a racially mixed, diverse community, 48% Black by that time. And it's described as a community in transition, and where Birmingham Southern College was playing an active role in this transition. There were parks being developed. There were investments in listening programs where community members could come onto the campus and study and learn. And it was very active in the way the school was. And then moving forward, 1976, an undergraduate leaves campus, is murdered, and the immediate reaction is that the gates need to be constructed. And there are racial implications there as well. But for the sake of time, I won't get into those. What I want to move to now is the message the gate sent today. That's what I think is the message that I want to leave you with, is that being a student of color on campus, a predominantly white campus surrounded by a Black neighborhood, one that people quickly write off as the hood or the ghetto or a number of other things. There are sayings that you hear on campus all the time, and this may be true at your school as well. And I argue that those messages come from the gates in the way that Margaret Kahn writes that particular places orchestrate social behavior. They give us a script of how to interact. And this was a script I picked up along the way while being at Birmingham Southern College. I served as a tour guide a number of times. And I found myself, when people always ask, well, do you feel safe on campus? What about the surrounding community? And the script told me to say that campus police does a great job. I feel safe. And the immediate pivot was to say, and this provides great community service opportunities in the surrounding community. You can tutor, you can do this, you can do that. And it wasn't until I began this research that I realized how problematic that really was, what message that sends not only to students of color on campus, as well as people in the community, administrators, white students at a PWI. And another one of those sayings I want to add real quick is that there was this notion of don't turn right. And because leaving campus, turning left meant getting on the highway, going downtown, going about your business, but turning right meant engaging with the local community. And so in this way, I mean, we said this so many times. I wish I had been tallying how many times I heard that saying of don't turn right. And what that meant was don't engage with Blackness, don't critically consider the policies that led to this community being the way you think that it is. And it just further problematized the people in the community around us as if we were somehow different than Black people outside the gates. And so to conclude, I would just leave you with that until we begin to critically think about how space is constructed and what those meanings are within, then our diversity and inclusion efforts are going to fall short time and time again until we begin to engage and move across the color line, as Du Bois writes, and I use throughout my text. So I want to thank you for the opportunity today, and I'm excited to hear the rest of our presenters. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Austin, sorry. And I'm having a little bit of camera problems, so I'll be back in a moment. Next we'll have, sorry, I jumped the gun there, Justin Zimmerman. He is a PhD candidate in political science at Northwestern University, studying international trust and race class subjugated communities institutional trust in race class subjugated communities in Chicago. Justin received a BA in political science and philosophy in 2009 and an MPA with a concentration in organizational management in 2011 from the University of Alabama. So nearby. Okay, take it away, Justin.
Great. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. At least morning for me. I'm going to share my screen. All right. Sorry. So my research is entitled "Race, Class, and the Politics of Situational Trust." As you already heard, I'm a fifth-year PhD candidate at Northwestern University, and I focus most of my research in the Chicago area, particularly the South Side. My research question is, how do race-class subjugated communities advocate for themselves against state and community violence? I use the term race-class subjugated communities in description of what Sauce and Weaver show are neighborhoods that are highly surveillanced, go through a lot of state violence and a lot of segregation, and are particularly for the purposes of my research, Black neighborhoods. When I say state violence, I'm talking about the violence that police are engaging in with citizens, and community violence is just the everyday violence that happens between residents. That's how I define it. Now, within researching my question, I started to notice that when I spoke to people within the greater Englewood neighborhood, which was the neighborhood I started off with first, a neighborhood that has a reputation for being fairly poor, suffering from a lot of community violence and state violence. When I first piloted my study, there was a lot of talk about still engaging with what I would consider are distrusted institutions within their communities, particularly the police, outside nonprofits, and local politicians. And I started doing research and really going through the sociology of what I was hearing, particularly what Monica Bell coins as situational trust. Now, Monica Bell uses it to talk particularly about working class Black women in Washington, D.C. and how they interact with the police to remedy certain situations that may be happening within the home, or to navigate particular institutions or the exceptions they have for particular police officers. But I think that that theory can be expanded into political science, and it can go back into talking about policy and talking about how Black communities in general, particularly race class subjugated communities, navigate trying to better their community, particularly in the realm of violence. So how I'm elaborating on situational trust is first that there has to be trust of an organization or institution. I'm talking about outside organizations. I'm talking about local politicians, the alderman, the mayor. Second, there's a need for relief for a community problem so dire that community members believe it is necessary to interact with traditionally distrusted organizations or institutions to mitigate the problem. With that, I came up with two hypotheses. First, that low household income and low collective efficacy will lead to citizens to have situational trust in traditionally distrusted institutions or organizations. And that's modeled into this model as well. Now, the case studies that I used were first Greater Englewood, which was my race class subjugated community, West Englewood and Englewood. The Douglas community, particularly the Bronzeville neighborhood, which is, the Black metropolis of Chicago, a place where a lot of Black people throughout history have done very well for themselves, but has greatly started to gentrify as time has gone on. And the Calumet Heights area, which is still a fairly wealthy Black neighborhood on the south side of Chicago. What I wanted to focus on was collective efficacy, the varying of resources within these neighborhoods, and the relationships that these residents have with police, outside organizations, and local politicians. The methods that I used changed before the pandemic and after the pandemic. Pre-pandemic, I was able to start an ethnography. I was able to go and meet people and see all these, and go to these organizations, go to the police meetings, go to church services, and really get to know the people and interview people, particularly in the Greater Englewood neighborhood where I started. So I managed to complete 10 interviews between January 16, 2019, and I concluded August 1st, 2019 in order to do my second year paper. Now, when I started doing more of the dissertation research, the pandemic hit. And we all were isolated to a point. We all were isolated and didn't quite get a chance to really interact with one another. So I did virtual focus groups, and I've been doing those since June, and I'm still currently doing them now. And I've interviewed 35 participants, 17 more from Englewood, 14 from Brownsville, and 4 from Calumet Heights. And the compensation was Kindle Fires, which I sent to them prior so that they would have access to the Zoom meeting. Now, what I heard from all of these people varied to an extent by neighborhood, but I'm still working through what that really means. So in the in the greater Englewood, you see, we are in the neighborhood, we are not as aggressive as we should be. We prefer to work with current commanders. We know they are doing wrong, but as Englewoodians, we are not aggressively looking for confrontation. What I found interesting was that though they understand that state violence is a problem, the community violence that's happening in a particular neighborhood is so troublesome that they still find it, at least certain members of the community still find themselves working with the police in order to remedy that, because they see that as the more direct problem. And you see, even with Michelle, I don't really like outside organizations, but bless their heart, they decide what they want to do before they enter. But at the same time, with the follow-up, they're still working with them and using them for funding, because they're still trying to better create a better community and trying to remedy some of the violence that's happening. Now, in the Douglas-Bronzeville area, it was a little bit more diverse as far as class of who I interviewed. I spoke to people who were former street organization members, and I also talked to people that were lawyers, that were even questioned whether or not they were gentrifiers. But one of the quotes that I really want you all to pay attention to is this one from Brenda, who worked for a violence interruption organization. If we have to make our presence known by walking side by side with you, the police, and letting the public know that we are not in conjoints with you, or we are not in cahoots with you, we're on stopping the violence. That's it. That's all. We don't have nothing to tell y'all. We don't have nobody to bring to y'all. None of that. So we address them just as such in every aspect. And then it's kind of like it deflates our credibility on the street. Causes the first thing they say is that we're working with the police. So we had to fight doing against that. And that goes along with street, knowing who we are. You understand what I'm saying? So it's okay that we are walking. I can't say it's okay, because some people still going to talk, but that's going along with them. Knowing the person that's walking side by side with the police, and knowing the reason and the mission of walking side by side with the police. So Brenda's saying that, I get it. I don't really trust the police, but I understand that they're needed in order to try to promote violence. But at the same time, I'm not cooperating with them, and I'm trying to make it clear to the community that I'm not cooperating with them. And with CALUMET is even more different. I know I'm running out of, they completely separate themselves, understand that, knowing that this is not a hood. This is community, I mean the challenge, and the second person, I mean the challenge to me are the people that come in here from outside, and I mean most of those people are doing and committing all the crime and things. So these folks completely separate themselves and aren't necessarily thinking in the mindset of having to distrust the institutions as much as having to push people who aren't a part of the community out to make sure they're not causing trouble. Now, I still need to do future research. So I still need to talk more about community trauma, because that came up a lot in my interviews and focus groups. I need to recruit more young folks to get a better understanding of who's really trusting the police, outside organizations, and politicians. And I also need to test my hypotheses using the Chicago Metropolitan Neighborhood Study. Thank you. And that's all.
Thank you very much, Justin. Next, we'll have Angela Pashayan, who is a PhD candidate at Howard University. Take it away, Angela.
Awesome. Hang on, let me get my video started. Okay, will somebody give me a wave if I start going into slow motion or some of those crazy things that happened? And Ananda, I'd appreciate it if you can give me a 1 when I've got a minute left, because I'm really bad at looking at my phone while I'm presenting. Thank you everybody for being here. Representing Howard University, PhD candidate in political science, and my work, I'm going to share my screen now. Let's make sure I'm doing this right. Okay. Can you all see my screen now? Awesome.
Yes.
Okay, let me move everything over a little bit here. Okay, I'm gonna leave my tabs up on the left, because if I start running out of time, I know what I can go to really, really quickly. I work with the Howard University Digital Informers, and we are a group that work under a grant from the Knight Foundation. And I thank the Knight Foundation so much for giving us the opportunity and funding us to do our work. And we work on the new frontier, which is basically, the world of race and disinformation and misinformation and how it's affecting Black communities. So this work that I'm going to share with you is still ongoing. And this is sort of like a interdisciplinary approach to the question of what can we do about misinformation and disinformation. And in my research, I'm finding that disinformation and misinformation go a lot deeper than impacting the Black community. It's impacting the whole United States. And when something impacts the whole United States, it rocks the world. So this is a piece that's a segue to what we're doing about misinformation and disinformation in Black community, and it is entitled Security in the New Frontier, Race, Disinformation, and the Psychology of Justification. It's basically, my approach is to provide this cross-disciplinary review of past research to help the reader see the links that constitute the depths of the US problem intertwined with race and politics. And only with this whole view practicum of how race has been overlooked as a critical issue can new solutions to the problem be devised. So what I'm getting at is that this is a bigger problem. It's not just a Black problem, it's a bigger problem, and it is affecting our country. My literature review for this piece is interdisciplinary. So I go to Moshman, who talks about epistemic cognition and development. So he gets into the psychology of justification and truth. I look at Edmond Gettier, who talks about justified true belief theory, because this is really based on beliefs, and it gets into psychology and inferences that we make based on our beliefs. I go to Hegel, way back from 1821. And he's so brilliant because you can surmise his work into this one sentence: all realities can be expressed rationally. And what that's saying is that no matter how irrational you think someone else is, they are able to express their rationality as real. Laswell is the king of public opinion and mass communication, so he's part of their literature review. Taylor talks about munitions of the mind. He talks about how propaganda is really like psychological warfare. Bonilla Silva talks about racism without racists. Why is that important? It's because there's people who don't think they're racist, but they actually are. And lastly, the report from the Select Committee on Intelligence from the US Senate, which came to the conclusion about Russian interference targeting Black communities, which swayed an entire US election. This last sentence is really important in the literature review, and it's from Taylor. And it says, consider the power of religion and the psyche, justification and aggression, morality, patriotism, and blind rationale. So there's a danger of abandoning propaganda in peacetime when it is needed to restore social relations and unify the country. In other words, intentional propaganda is needed to bridge dialogue between different people. So I'll move on to security and race, because when you see this presentation, you're going to see me talk about a lot of different aspects. Again, it's, interdisciplinary. So security and race. Racism, we know, was central in the formation of the United States. We know that the transatlantic slave trade basically made America the wealthiest country in the world. It's the work of Blacks that made this country number one. We know that the police were formed as a security group to recover escaped slaves, which were property. We know that Blacks were guilty when they tried to run away from slavery. They were guilty of stealing themselves away from their masters. So that's the foundation of who we are. And in that lies our weakness. This racialized thinking is our greatest weakness. We move on to disinformation and misinformation. And you guys may or may not know the difference, but disinformation is, purposely put out there to deceive someone, where misinformation is sort of unintentional, like you're misinformed. We go to the history of where does misinformation and disinformation come from? It's not new. It's actually very, very old, because Blacks were deceived about their capabilities and their value to society since the beginning of time. We've been told that we're not worth anything, that we have no value. That's the history of deceit on purpose from the beginnings, 1600s. Slaves were disinformed about their purpose and about the purpose of whites using them for maximum profit. Disinformation targeted at Blacks began as a form of domestic oppression. It kept going with the right to vote, where Blacks were continually disinformed about the conditions. So even when we were told you could vote, we were still disinformed about the conditions, right up to the time we'd walk up to the poll and have to count the number of, or guess the number of marbles that were in, a jar. So we have been disinformed from the very, very beginning. This is nothing new at all. Changing attitudes. As attitudes changed in the late 1800s against slavery, attitudes have been reversing since the 2000s, making race a political and social inflection point of tension. So just because attitudes seem to get better for a while, now we're going back to where we started. Domestic terror is an issue that is affecting more than just Blacks, okay? So this white supremacy has existed ever since slavery. It's a crazy puzzle that intertwines race and security. White supremacy groups are a form of domestic terror. So, we talk about terrorism, and we're always looking to the Middle East or somewhere else. No, we're the ones that do the terror, and we do it the best. And it's been that way since our inception. We do have hate laws against hate groups, but they're not strong enough, because our hate groups can still meet, protest, march, and they can still expand their hate propaganda. And here's a statistic that we should all know, that in 2019, 90% of those who died from domestic extremism were victims of alt-right groups. They weren't victims of, somebody in the Middle East trying to bomb something. No, 90% of those who died were victims of alt-right groups. That's an astounding percentage. So domestic terror, don't point the finger outside of the United States. The finger points right here at us. Then you move on to foreign adversaries and how they use propaganda through social media to inflame this whole issue. Discord and self-justification via social media. The Senate intelligence reports have already shown it. It's been proven. China, Russia, Iran, from 2014 to 2017. And what happens? The result is we get an unlikely, unqualified president to win the US 2016 election. That's real power, to be able to put somebody in office who is completely unqualified. The thing is that 82% of Americans use social media daily, and 20% of Americans actually get their news from social media and nowhere else, just from social media. So you can see that soft power arises successfully with the manipulation of citizens via emotion and identity on social media. Self-justification is empowered through identity and social media groups. So there's lots of different arguments that I could propose here, but I tried my best to kind of smush it into three areas. One is that we have this problem with colorblind racism, where people think they're not racist, but they actually are. And they have self-serving justifications. There's another argument that domestic terror is not new, and it's currently being used via social media. And the last, that we have weak legislation, and it really needs to be fixed. But one of the tough things about that legislation goes right back up to the top, colorblind racism. You have people who say, hey, we've got legislation against hate crimes, but they're missing some of the key elements because they are victims of colorblind racism. So there's some quick analysis I want to go through, and this really needs to be fleshed out for this full research paper because there's data that needs to be shown for this. But I've got analysis for 3 different areas. One is behavioral psychology with Pittarello in 2015. He did an experiment where he's rolling dice on a table, and it's a situation where if the number shown on the dice lands closest to this fixed point, and you look at the numbers, the higher numbers will pay the person more, whoever rolled the dice. If the high number's there, then they get more money. So this is an experiment. And the hypothesis is that people are going to lie about the numbers. Okay, so the methodology is here. If anybody wants these slides, I'm happy to send them to you. But the result is that the hypothesis is supported, that people lie when benefits are self-serving. So when you are in charge of reading the number on the dice and you can say whatever number you want, you will, because it's self-serving, you get more money, okay? So that's how blind spots develop when ethical considerations are ambiguous, right? When nobody's watching you or you're not quite too sure, who's watching you and you can get away with something, you will. And that's what happens with racism. Here's something else with Bonilla Silva, where analysis of his work, which was qualitative work, he put people in a situation where they could converse about racism and different racial issues. And his hypothesis was that people don't think they're racist, but they actually are. His methodology, again, like I said, was open-ended questions, conversations, interviews. And his result was that his hypothesis is supported, that participants accept notions of equality, but they don't really accept the actuality of equality. So they can talk about, oh, yes, I'm not racism, not racist. But when it comes down to actually seeing that put in place, that they are, in fact, racist. Here's one more piece. A.M. Lee, I did analysis on his work in 1945, lots of work on propaganda. This gets really, really deep and heavy, and this could be a paper within itself. It also ties into the work of McCoy and Major in 2007, but there's varying levels of influence, and this is the big word, manipulation. Manipulation happens, or you could call it mass persuasion happens. It's contained in words, symbols, colors, all those kind of things play a role on our psyche. And it becomes like this psychological manipulation of what we believe. McCoy and Major did the same kind of thing about belief systems for the American dream. Their hypothesis was that meritocratic beliefs support the justification of inequality. And through group conversations, he found out that that hypothesis is actually supported. So with that analysis, there's the last with Shalvey and Jola, who did work in 2015 and 2018 about self-serving justifications. Basically, self-serving justifications they lead to doing wrong while feeling morally correct. And without going through all of what Shalvey did and what Jola did, you can just use the January 6th insurrection to know that doing wrong while feeling morally correct is a real thing. Quickly, I'll go to this analysis, which it's a photo credit from the Southern Poverty Law Center in 2015. Now there's an updated version, but I wanted to go to 2015 just to show you active hate groups, where they are in the United States and how many of them, 892 to be precise. I don't even want to see this map right now because I'm sure these numbers are higher, but this is what's happening. This is the reality of the hate groups in this country. And as you can see, if you're a foreign adversary, why not attack the strongest country in the world with its weakest link? Hate crimes based on racism. So in conclusion, security, race, disinformation, and the psychology of justification are really, really important to the security of this country. This country can be taken down because of race if this issue is not fixed. America's blind spot is racism, and US laws must be strengthened on hate crimes. The difficult thing is we have to wake up the whites who are making the laws, because they are the ones that are colorblind, that are victims of colorblind racism. They can't see it. And so it's very hard to shake up the giant and tell him, hey, you know, you don't even realize what's happening because you are a victim, you know, of this colorblind racism. But that's what we are up against. I want to say, this is a quote from myself about social media, that it is the malicious intent of the sender and the vulnerability of the recipient that creates the greatest security risk. Stronger laws on social media accounts plus positive propaganda can affect and potentially heal domestic divisions. And when I talk about positive propaganda, I mean purposely putting out propaganda that says, you know, we can get along, or, you know, white and black doesn't matter, you know, those kind of things, putting things out there so that people can see something different. My recommendations are to quash psychological justification through federally mandated educational programs, to launch digital literacy programs that foster knowledge about the power of emotional content, to launch long-term propaganda campaigns to unify society. And we need to do this, formal reconciliation. It is needed from our government for moral reasons and to finally close the door on race-related issues. And with that, I close. I hope I did that in my time frame. Anand, did I do it? Oh my God. I'm so sorry, but let me stop sharing so we can move on.
Yeah, we are actually, the panel session is actually done, but I want to take at least one. Thank you very much, Angela.
You're welcome.
Also a great presentation. I want to, rather than, I'm going to forego my role as discussed, and I do have comments, as I said in the email, I'll send you all comments. So I want to forego just to give our audience an opportunity just to get one question in from the audience, because technically we are actually, our session is actually done, but I would, if anybody has any questions from the audience. No, okay, all right. No hands up. Well, good. So, like I said, technically we are actually done, but that is a good. Does anybody have any of the panelists have any questions for anybody else? All right. Well, I will. Hang on. Was that a? All right, well, I will, let's see if I can run through this really quickly. So I'm just gonna read this. There are, excuse the brusqueness of it. So I'm gonna go in order of the presenters. So Vaughn's paper exposed the psychological warfare of self, which is, I think, a powerful and evocative framing of an important consequence of social death. In this way, the paper is able to explore the quote, ideology of the long-term psychological effects of racism on African Americans, unquote. It is concerning, though, that, quote, if an individual is cognizant of the systems where racism is orchestrated, then an individual will be unable to conceptualize their oppression in its entirety, unquote. And I was wondering, why is this so? It would seem that if an individual is conscious of these systems, this would be a crucial step in conceptualizing their oppression and thus combating it. Perhaps this points to a difference between cognizing something and conceptualizing something. What could that difference be? All right, on to Austin. So these are just quick hits. Sorry that this is so. So Austin's piece, to me, the key idea in Austin's paper seems to be that it wants to explore the claim that, quote, a psychical enclosure can close off other social realities. I love that phrase. This formulation defines the implications of the material under study, the metaphoric and physical import of the gates that encapsulate so much of the paper's theoretical potential. In order to reach this potential, however, there are a few parts to the paper that could use some development and refinement. First, I would strongly recommend drawing the connection between the gates closing off of social realities and Du Bois's conception of the color line in the section that follows that discussion. A line like a gate or fence has sides to it, and I think that the feature of lines and fences would be fruitful to think through. Following on from this is the question posed at the end of the paper, but which certainly occurred to me much early on, is this. While the paper spends much of its time describing how the gates define the BSc community's worldview, I wonder what the communities beyond the boundary think of the gates specifically, and what in general the institution it represents and closes off means to them. There's more there for Austin. Justin's, the question of social trust is important in any political community. As such, the questions this paper raises are vital for race, class, subjugated communities to be able to take agency in their own emancipation. And so one of the questions I have is the best way to capture trust through what the state does to a community? Or is it through what services the community seeks from the state? And I know that the paper talks about that to some extent, but I'm wondering what the juxtaposition of violence by the state and community violence, that distinction does. That is, should the key metric be violence visited upon a community, or should it be what services a community seeks from the state? Of course, violence could be a key determinator because of its critical character in defining a state, and here I'm thinking of Weber, and whether community members trust the state with violence, and that is to use violence to intervene to prevent or mitigate violence within the community. That seems to be a really crucial part that needs to be underscored. Since all the key informants are Black and identified as such, is it important to identify the race of the interviewer in that process? What was the purpose of including respondents from rapidly gentrifying neighborhoods? I missed that part. Oh, well, last part is, and you kind of alluded to this in your presentation, I wonder whether breakdowns by gender, sexuality, and income might yield significant results as well. All right. Angela, this is indeed an ambitious paper. It seeks to combine in its analysis several disciplinary modes, and as such, it must be commended for this attempt. It might make sense to slow down for a bit and really take apart some of the concepts it deploys. For example, security is a multifaceted, multidimensional dynamic. The paper gestures towards this in discussing national and domestic security related to slavery and white supremacy historically and in contemporary politics. What is clear about the latter relates to domestic security. Sorry, while it is clear how the latter, that is white supremacy, how that relates to domestic security, is less clear how slavery is implicated in national security in the historical context section of the paper. Unless, of course, what you're saying is that it sets up what is here today. And I think that needs to be better explained. Explaining the seemingly minor aspect of the paper might shed light on the larger aims of the paper. All right. Sorry, let me stop there. I know that was brief. I will send these comments to you much more fleshed out. But I just want to get you some of those comments now before you go off to your other panels. I'm really pushing it here. We're 9 minutes over. Does anybody have any questions for me or for anybody else? Otherwise, I'll end the session.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
I know that was ridiculously fast, and I just rushed through a bunch of stuff there. No, like I said, I'll send you more.
Awesome.
But thank you all. These are all really great papers and presentations.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
All right, everybody. Take care. Janelle, I'm going to just sit around until everybody's gone. That's my usual thing.
Okay, thank you. I'll duck out to my next panel.
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
No problem. Thank you.